Coach Bill Curry, I hope you're having a great afternoon, sir. Welcome into the game in T-Town.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm just curious, when you hear the name Bart Starr and we try to pay tribute to a legendary player, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Bart Starr?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that which distinguished him as a human being. Forget for a moment that he is probably the greatest winner of all time in our sport when it comes to what he did in the playoffs. But just think about the human being off the field. How does a person treat folks who can't do anything for that person? How does a person treat people that are down on their luck and maybe are just a child or a homeless person? How are those people treated? And I think that is true greatness. People who are kind and generous with all folks, I think those are the great people. And Bart Starr was one of the very, very few that I've known that was 100% on there. It was just incredible to be with him and walk down the street because people flocked to him and he never turned away. He was never rude. It was hard to believe. And I said, how do you do that? He said, how do you do what? He wasn't even aware of it. He was amazing.
Well, certainly, as we've done the last couple of days, we've tried to feature different people that can share stories and kind of help us honor certainly a legend in Alabama history, but in Green Bay. When you left Georgia Tech and went to Green Bay to play for the Packers, what was that relationship like? The first time you walk in and you have a chance to talk with Bart Starr, and at that point he'd already been a part of history, but kind of maybe your first introduction to Bart Starr.
Really buckle my knees. I mean, I'm walking over from the dorm to eat dinner on a Saturday night. It was the night of the team scrimmage, so it was late afternoon, and this was the pregame meal for the inter-squad scrimmage. And I had just reported from the college all-star game. I'm talking about I had been on the campus at St. Norbert for half an hour, and I'm walking over to dinner, and I didn't know anybody. I had met Bart Starr briefly at a department store in Atlanta a few years earlier, but that was it. And suddenly I realized he was walking by my side. And so I turned and, gee, Mr. Starr. He said, no, get rid of the Mr. stuff. I'm just Bart. And after a few steps, I realized he was going to walk all the way to dinner with me. And I was terrified of what was going to happen. I didn't know if they were going to throw food or make me sing my school song or whatever. I heard a lot of stuff about the NFL training camps. And his first words out of his mouth were, Bill, I don't know what your faith is, but Cherry and I have a wonderful Methodist church, and if you'd like to join us for church tomorrow and come to our house for Sunday dinner, we'd love to have you. Those were the first words to a last-round draft choice. I will never forget them. And his attitude and Cherry's attitude, the family, toward us, never changed in all the years since.
Wow. That's an awesome story, and I'm reminded whenever you said, because I felt like I owed him that honor of saying Mr. Starr because of his legacy and he said the same words to me just maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He said, please don't call me Mr. Starr, it's Bart. And as you were saying that, I'm kind of reminded of that attitude as well. It was always a great for a young and up-and-coming reporter.
That's right. And if you had the privilege of being around him any time at all, you noticed, I'm sure, that he treated everybody the same way.
Yes, sir. But I mean, I look back and I look at your playing days in Green Bay was just a couple of years, 65 and 66. But obviously somehow you guys formed a relationship because you were brought back, and it's my understanding that he helped you kind of start. You started at Georgia Tech for 1 year as an assistant coach, but then you quickly made it back to Green Bay as assistant coach in 77, 78, and 79. Obviously, there was a strong relationship formed with you and Bart Starr.
Yeah, another incredible component of Bart's character was that if he ever told you he was going to do something, then that's exactly what he did. And he told me early, yes, I was put on the expansion list and claimed by New Orleans, been traded to Baltimore, ended up being on a bitter rival of the Packers. But that didn't change Bart's attitude toward Carolyn and me. He'd come through Atlanta and call me. We'd go to dinner, and he would say to me, if I ever get a big job, I'm going to hire you. Now, every one of us has people say stuff like that to us. And our people mean well, and they usually don't deliver. Well, he delivered. When he got the big job, he called. And it was just overwhelming to have the privilege to go and work for him. And I certainly would never have been considered for the head job at Georgia Tech if Bart Starr had not hired me to coach the O-line for the Packers.
We're talking with Coach Bill Curry, certainly his time here in Tuscaloosa, and we're trying to pay tribute to Bart Starr and the legendary status of Bart Starr, which will be remembered at a public memorial service on June the 9th, 3 until 5, on Samford University's campus, the Riot Center, and it is a public memorial service as we'll pay tribute to Bart Starr and the impact. But, Coach Curry, I look at the impact, and we were talking with Joe Namath last Friday, had a chance to feature him, and I love to talk history of the game of football and how all these guys impacted our lives in some different way. I mean, we love the game of football, but it's kind of fun to see the guys that are on this big pedestal. I mean, growing up in this state, Bart Starr was on that pedestal with Kenny Stabler and Joe Namath and Steve Sloan and all the greats. But then I guess maybe that's the way that he kind of came down to our level. Knowing that he was on this pedestal, he tried to create that common ground between all of us. And I think the great ones usually do that.
He wouldn't allow you to keep him on the pedestal. He would force his way by just sheer kindness. And I don't mean by being arrogant. I mean, he would just do things that would blow your mind. And even in the most horrendous circumstances, he and Sherry lost their young son, Brett, to drugs and alcohol. And it was just that is the worst thing that can happen in the world to a couple. And I called, I didn't even know what to say. I was just so agonized for them. And I said, what do you want to do? What are you going to do? He said, well, we need to recover, but when we recover, when we're adequately able to function, we want to try to get to as many young people as we can and try to keep them from making the same mistakes that Brett made. I said, well, would you be able to speak to our Alabama team? I was in Alabama at the time. He said yes, and I'll let you know. And I thought, man, that's a lot to ask, and I really didn't expect him to do it. Well, a few months later, Bart called. I called a team meeting, and in walked not just Bart, but Bart and Sherry. And when I introduced them to speak to our squad, Bart didn't stand up. Sherry did. And Sherry started to talk about her son and how her son was a good young man, just like everybody in that room, and what can happen when you start doing things that you don't need to be doing. And she kind of faltered at one point. And try to grasp this scene now. You got 105 or however many Alabama football players are sitting there mesmerized. And instead of taking over, Bart went and put his arm around Sherry. She got herself together and finished her message. And then she sat down, and he eyeballed those guys and talked about what it was like in the streets and what it was like to be an NFL general manager and head coach, and if they wanted their future to be what it should be at the University of Alabama and beyond, here are the things that you do and you don't do, and I promise you lives were saved that day. That was their response to life's worst tragedy. I just can't think of anything greater than that.
Well, and it's something that was very close to him. Every interview that I ever did, he talked about the charity that he had created and the awareness of just talking publicly. And sometimes I guess when we're in the valley of life, you take a valley and you're able to help somebody else. I guess that's what Bart did over those years. And you think about the lives and the youth that he touched in Green Bay and back in the state of Alabama with his unique charity of taking as you said, a tragedy and making the good out of something that was negative.
And we all have opportunities to do things like that, and sometimes we do. But Bart did it every time. And, I didn't sit and document these things. I just happened to be privy to some of them. But it's how he lived his life. And he wasn't perfect. He was a human being, but he was a wonderful human being. And Cherry, of course, is as well.
Coach Curry, did Bart have an influence on you taking the Alabama job? I mean, did he play a role because of your relationship with him?
Oh, of course. All I knew of Alabama was Bart, who had been my teammate, and then Coach Bryant, who was incredibly kind to me and actually coached me in one of those college all-star game things one time. And so I was sort of in awe of those two people. And I had some other Alabama friends, Steve Sloan, Joe Namath, and I got to be buddies in the Senior Bowl. So I was very impressed with all of them. And yes, of course, that had an influence.
Hey, Coach, I'm kind of curious when you talk about, because we're down in Destin for the SEC spring meetings. We're on location, and we're trying to spend a lot of time covering this event, but also covering Bart Starr and then the tragedy that happened over in Auburn with the voice, Rod Bramlett. The states, we've had a couple of sad events happen to us, and we're trying to cover both of those. Did you ever have a chance to run into the voice of the Auburn Tigers, Rod Bramlett?
I met him, but I didn't get to know him well. I am just so sorry for the whole Auburn family about this tragedy of Rod and his wife. And I wish I had known them better, and I'm just heartsick. This kind of tragedy occurred, and everybody will certainly be in my prayers. And I have a special link with the Auburn folks, too, because Auburn people were so nice to Bill and Eleanor Curley, my parents, who lived in Opelika for many years, and everybody from Auburn always treated them with grace and dignity, and I will never forget that.
Coach, what's it like at some of these spring meetings when you put 12 football coaches or 10 at the time? What's it like to put that football coaches into a room and try to discuss improving the game of college football?
You don't want to know.
Okay. I'm just trying to pick your brain for a couple of seconds here. Sure.
I'm just messing with you. Sometimes the sparks fly. Usually everybody's polite to each other, and sometimes there are disagreements, and you get things out on the table. It's very productive. It's very important to get to have those meetings and to say some things that need to be said in the privacy of that room. And sometimes outside the room, just man-to-man, one-on-one, to get some things said and clear the air. I think they're very productive. And you also form some good friendships with guys that maybe you didn't think you would like. You find out they're good guys after all.
Coach, do you like the direction of college football?
No. I don't like the idea of transferring and leaving your teammates. I understand why certain players do it. I don't blame them, but the idea of staying the course and being loyal and building friendships between guys from different backgrounds, that's the great thing that football offers. And I just hate to see guys transferring and leaving. And sometimes it's absolutely necessary, and I know that. And there's a situation at Alabama that just happened. I think that had to happen. But I think there are a lot of other ones where guys are just capriciously changing from one school to the other. I don't like seeing that. I just think that's destructive.
It's been a major topic of conversation here at the SEC spring meetings, and it seems that this likeness and the endorsement policy the NCAA is considering, not that it's implemented yet, but they're even considering allowing student athletes to benefit from endorsements, and they could really open up a really large can of worms right here in this next couple of months with some of these NCAA meetings.
They sure could, and I want to be clear that I believe Jalen Hurts handled himself beautifully every step of the way. and I don't blame him for anything he did. I'm talking about guys that just jump ship and leave their team in the lurch when they could stay and contribute. And I don't think the young men are thinking clearly, and I think there's some folks talking to those people. And when you start talking about rewarding the guys for their images, now what you've done is you've created just another National Football League. I mean, that's what it'll be. So let's be sure we know what we're doing before we pull that trigger.
Coach, final question to pay tribute to Bart Starr, but one of the things that we like to do is preserve legacy of players. Had a chance a couple of months ago to be in Kansas City and meet with Derrick Thomas's son. He looks identical. I mean, I felt like I was sitting there eating lunch with Derrick Thomas because he's identical to the looks of Derrick Thomas. I wish that maybe I could ask you the final question and just spend a couple of minutes talking about Derrick Thomas, because you had a chance to coach him at the University of Alabama, and a legendary player here in T-Town.
Best football player I ever coached, and I was privileged to coach many great, I mean, not just great young men, but I mean really great players, number one draft choice. And I remember Marty Schottenheimer and Bill Cowher, who was his defensive coordinator, flew to Tuscaloosa to talk to me about why they didn't think Derrick Thomas was a number one draft choice. They said, look, he's a 6'2", 230-pound guy, and you're talking about the fourth pick in the first round. I think they had the fourth pick or the sixth pick somewhere in there. I said, well, let me just. And Marty was a long-time friend of mine. I didn't know Cowher very well. I said, look, y'all, let me make this conversation real brief. You can either take Derrick Thomas, or you can get your brains beat out by Derrick Thomas for the next 15 years, because he's going to be the best pass rusher you have ever seen the day he steps into training camp, and that's a promise. And that's what happened. I mean, they took him, and Cowher, years later, told me he would have never been a head coach if he hadn't drafted Derrick Thomas. Derrick was so dominating, such a great, and he just had this relentless, incredible desire to win the game, to get to the quarterback. I mean, we played Penn State one day in Birmingham, and the great Don Lindsay, our coordinator, basically invented a defense for Derrick. Penn State had a freshman quarterback, Tony Sackett. Derrick made 25 tackles. They hadn't made an inch yet. We beat them 8-3 because of Derrick Thomas. And he could just take a game over and dominate it like nobody I've ever seen.
Coach Curry, do you ever think about Derrick Thomas in the current era of college football where they're throwing, 45, 50 times a game? You ever think about the numbers that he could have put up in the current time of college football?
Well, not only the numbers he would put up, but the way his defenses would dominate, because you'd have to double team him. And they're throwing the ball so much now. There's no way, and nobody could block him by themselves when we had him, or when he got to Kansas City. But in today's football, where they're spreading the field and they got people running all over the place, you'd have to have two people to block him, which means everybody else is one-on-one. I don't know how you'd get a ball thrown. He would dominate more in today's football than he did even when he played, because the run game was so much more a part of that era than it is now.
Hey, Coach, we've often heard a myth, and maybe you can confirm this, maybe this is true or maybe it's not, but we've often heard that Derrick Thomas would even work out with the defensive backs, that he would be over helping the defensive backs, and they'd be looking for Derrick Thomas, and he would be over training with the defensive backs, covering wide receivers at 6'3" and 255 pounds.
Well, he didn't do that at our practices because we made him stay where he was supposed to be. I will tell you, we might have considered using him in coverage. And the honest answer to that is I don't remember. But I promise you, if we had put him out against sort of a normal wide receiver, he would have had no trouble stuffing him and running all over the field with him. He wouldn't have gotten open, I'll tell you that.
Well, Coach Curry, listen, thank you so much for talking about Derrick Thomas, but also helping us pay tribute to Bart Starr, certainly a living legend here in Tuscaloosa and throughout the state of Alabama. Thank you again for your time, sir.